Now, that said, that I'll open it up for questions, comments. Tony has, as I said, an appointment with his doctor, so we can have half 30 minutes, 20 minutes, Tony?
Yeah, 30 minutes is fine. Yeah.
Yeah, fine.
If there are that many questions, there may
Right.
not be.
Yeah. I have a few questions, but I'll ask them later. But I invite my colleagues for questions and comments. Yes. Murshid, would you like to begin? Or we can
Can you
have,
turn on your camera, Morshid?
yeah. Others can turn on your cameras.
Yeah, because
That,
it's
yes.
hard to just talk to a
Yeah.
blank screen.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Professor Stewart, for the highly illuminating talk. Yeah, this is a learning experience, as Professor Purkas has already said. We are learning from you how to engage with these texts, and how try to. Our attempt is to mainstream these, quote unquote, obscure and minor texts, and we are learning from you. My question. I was reading the introduction to your book that has the title, The Needle. Yeah,
Needle at the bottom of the sea. Yeah.
Needle at the bottom of the sea and fabulous tales. And the question that came to my mind is that the kind of Islam, uh, that comes about from these, tales and stories. There is a talk these days that Indian Islam is different. It is moral. Perhaps we need to talk about an Indic version of Islam. So, what do you think? Does these stories, uh, you know, uh, allow us to think Islam differently from the quote unquote center of Islam? Arabia and other centers. So the kind of Islam that emerges from these stories and texts, uh, your comment on that. And second point, you said that the labels, categories, Muslim and Hindu, they became exclusive only in the 19th and 20th century. And prior to that, the texts are testimony to the fact that the people, they lived together without bothering much about crossing the boundaries. So what
Well,
went
not
wrong
entirely,
actually?
but yes. Yeah.
Yeah, what went wrong actually? Maybe that is a big question, but yeah, that is one more point that I have in my mind right now. These two is
Well, yeah, let me address repeat again very briefly your first question.
yeah, the kind of Islam that emerges
Okay,
from
yeah.
these stories and tales.
You're right. Okay, yeah. First of all, most of these stories don't teach Islam, even though they're called Musulmani tales, and the characters are Sufis or fakirs of various sorts. They don't explicitly teach. Now, what they do is they allow Islam to become sort of naturalized in the Bangla environment. The terminology, the figures, and here's where the seeking equivalence, at least initially, a Shonashi and a fakir were roughly equated. And in fact, in a lot of the Shatopir materials, he transforms. He appears as Shiva, he appears as Krishna, he appears as a Shonashi, he appears as a fakir. He even appears sometimes as a goddess. And the idea was that there was an interchangeability. But the work of, and this is where I shifted my questioning to, what kind of cultural work are these tales actually undertaking? And I think what they're doing is they're naturalizing an Islamic world into a Bangla traditional Indic framework. And initially you sought equivalence, and then gradually you incorporate the technical terminology that's appropriate. Although there are, of course, um, inevitable differences. And I think this is something Islam changes everywhere it goes. And if people try to say it's one Islam, the word is the same, is about all I'll say. But the way it's practiced, I mean, the way it's practiced in the Sultanate period, or the way in the Mughal period, the way Islam is conceived is radically different. In fact, what is it? The Balkans to Bengal complex is all about this, where as it expands, the form of Islam changes and adapts itself to each culture. Now, the Quran is the Quran only in Arabic. Otherwise, it has to be called a translation or retelling of the Quran. So the Quran is really the only thing that remains stable in its Arabic form throughout the Islamic world. But the practices, the languages that are used to teach, all of those things differ. Now, it might interest you to know that with my partner, Samira Sheikh, the historian here at Vanderbilt, we put together a series of five workshops on Islam at the margins, or on the outside the mainstream. And we brought in close to 90 scholars from around the world to look and present papers on the various forms of Islam that are not Arab-centric or Arabic-centric. And it was just remarkably eye-opening, the variety. And if I can, I'll try to dredge up a list of all of the speakers during that series. This was about 4 or 5 years ago. We did this over a period of a couple of years. But this idea that Islam changes as it moves has not been sufficiently embraced. And what I was saying about the semantic field of terms, when a Persian term is brought into Bangla, initially when I was translating, I would transliterate it as the Persian term. But I discovered that the Bangla term may not mean the same thing exactly. There might be a 90% overlap or even a 99%, but there's still something that's not quite perfect in the matching of the Bangla term and the original term. So I've gone now too, if you look at Witness to Marvels and Needle, I transliterate the words exactly as they are written in Bangla. And the other thing I do, Bangla is shifting. It's not standardized in this period. And so when I transliterate, I might have 3 different spellings of the same word in the same sentence. And it's the whole point of this is not to make it harder for you to read, but rather to embrace the fact and illustrate the fact that the language is transforming as the culture is transforming. It's not fixed. So in that sense, I think that the changes that take place as Islam moves from culture to culture really needs to be more widely recognized. Now, many of the stories, and in fact, Shoshi Bhushan Dasgupta does this as well. He tells stories like about the knots, and then he gives you a theological interpretive apparatus to read that story. But none of that theology is actually in the story. The story of Gopi Chand, I've translated to Gopi Chandra Shonash. It's a very rough draft, mind you, but I've translated it. And I'm sorry, there is no specific instruction on knot techniques of meditation or anything. Now, it says he meditates, but it doesn't give content. So these stories are designed to make familiar these images, these types of figures, the types of practices that are alluded to, but they're not instructional. And it's only later when a guru or sheikh or someone comes along and says, this is how you are supposed to read this text. And then you get all of this theological explanation, but it's not in the text proper. The same thing with all of the great North Indian Sufi allegories. If you look carefully, like Chandayan or any of the others, these things frequently have no content specifically theological. They allude to it, but it's not there. The allegory and the theological interpretation of the allegory lies outside the text. So here's where I'm arguing we need to take, at least I have taken, and I think others would benefit from it, taking a literary approach. Read the text as a piece of literature rather than as a religious text. And like I said, I did that little experiment with Jabun. I substituted man with a hat and a beard for every time I saw the word Jabun. And it just changed dramatically the way I ended up reading those texts. It took away that religious onus, and particularly in today's environment, this is incredibly important. So in that sense, I think there's an awareness we need to have about what's actually being said in the text and what's being brought to the text from outside. Now, remind me again of your second question.
Yeah, so what went wrong? Because in these stories and texts, we see that there is a syncretic, practice very much present.
Yeah.
And what went wrong? How these, categories of being Muslim and Hindu became exclusive?
Yeah, I don't know that, what went wrong is going to produce much of an answer, because that's a value. And truth questions and value questions are only answerable if you believe certain things. So we need to learn to ask questions that actually have answers. And what we can say is, here's what the text actually says, and here's the context. This is where the imaginaire becomes important for situating a text in its environment, in that larger context.
Mm-hmm.
And if we do that, then we avoid the questions of things like, what went wrong. Now, I think we can put a finger on the census of 1882, where checkbox implied exclusivity. And it was beyond the imagination of the British that you could be two things at once, or that you as a Muslim could participate in a Hindu ritual and vice versa. And yet, from your own experience, and I've seen it in West Bengal, I've seen it in Bangladesh, there is a routinely crossover. If your village, celebrates Durga Puja and you're a Muslim, you exchange gifts. You go to the pandals, you have the sweets that you take to your friends, and all of this kind of stuff, and vice versa. So rather than emphasizing identity and identity politics, which is what the checkbox implies, you're either this or you're that, rather look at what people do. And that's where Hinduani, Muslimani, as opposed to Hindu and Muslim. But also it relieves us of the burden of saying they are a certain something, but rather they're acting in a way that is complementary to or congruent with other Muslims or other Hindus or traditional Indic perspectives. He has a Shastraic perspective on this. I've got examples in some of the texts. I just translated an Ola Bibi text, the goddess of cholera, or the goddess. Yes, see, I did it right there. She's the Musalmani matron of cholera. And the king looks at her and says, I know from my Shastraic knowledge that you, Ola Bibi, are more powerful than Shitala. And that's why Ola Bibi had afflicted him with cholera, because he was a worshiper of Shitala and was ignoring her. And he finally argues using Shastraic, and he actually explicitly names a text with using this kind of logic, and he identifies it as such. He says, well, there's no question that Ola Bibi, you're more powerful because your disease works faster, it kills faster, it's more painful, whereas smallpox is drawn out over time and it doesn't always kill. And so actually Munis would embrace cholera because it would get them to mukti so much faster. And so he constructs this incredible argument. And so the point here is that there's a kind of how do you approach issues? How do you make decisions about what you do? What do you draw on to decide or to argue in favor of one position or another? And I think this is where getting away from you are a Muslim as opposed to what do you do as Musulmani actions that are consistent with other Musulmans. I think that kind of approach at least relieves us a little bit. It doesn't evade the issue altogether. As for what went wrong, well, I mean, the census is where we like to put the finger, but then it's always easy to blame the British for everything. So.
Yeah, that's a great answer because I think the best answer reading Tony's books would be that what went wrong is now reading, the way we read things, and that is where things went wrong, and that is exactly what Tony has tried to say, that how to read the text, not to read the text in the way we are trained to read it, in identity oriented way.
Exactly.
So yeah,
Exactly.
yeah.